Executive Officer of HOPE, Hispanas Organized for Political Equality.
Good morning and welcome everyone, and welcome to our second day of Latina Action Day, our virtual Latina Action Day, as we make adjustments and pivoted to ensure that Latinas always have a voice in Sacramento and are ready to be the strong advocates that we know we all are. So welcome back also to all of you who joined us yesterday. It was a very informative conversation on the state budget, some not so great news, but a lot of things that we could be advocating for. I want to make sure you all have your coffee this morning like I do, mi cafecito. We're going to have a fantastic conversation. As we all know, California continues to act in response to the economic and health fallout of coronavirus. We must, as a community, start strategizing how we build a better and more equitable state post-COVID-19. For our communities, access to education opportunities can be the difference between thriving or falling into poverty. It's my pleasure and honor to share this space for dialogue today between Latina advocates like yourself, decision makers, and key community leaders in the education space specifically. I want to thank the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for investing in HOPE and for hosting this important panel. I'm looking forward to the conversation. I'm looking forward to seeing your comments on chat. Please make use of the Q&A function of Zoom. And I'm very pleased that I was joined this year by our dear friend, Latina Action Day Chair and Honorary HOPE Leadership Institute member, who is the Chief Executive Affairs Officer for Planned Parenthood Los Angeles, Melinda Vasquez. Melinda, thank you for joining us this morning and all the work that you've done for Latina Action Day.
Good morning, Helen, and all the mujeres here. I have my cafecito, and I'm ready to go. Yesterday was so amazing, and I know today will be equally amazing. And the topic of education is so near and dear to all of our hearts. As a California commissioner on the status of women and girls, we know, and I know, the importance of an quality education and equality in education. And I'm actually really proud to share that just this week, the Commission on the Status of Women and Girls unanimously voted in support of ACA 5, which is authored by Assemblywoman Shirley Weber. And what ACA 5 does is it actually puts before the voters the opportunity to repeal Proposition 209, which so many of us activists, Latina activists, and policy changers started working on in the 90s. So ACA 5 is moving through the legislature and will be up to reconsider whether or not race and gender can be used in education. And we know that a quality education and equal access to education is a great equalizer. So many disparities in our community, which is why today's conversation is so critical as we discuss what are the barriers for Latinas, and they include being an English language learner like I was once upon a time. What do we need to do to address and to take action to really remove those opportunity gaps for Latinas in our schools? And how do we support parents in that also? We are, as Helen, you've mentioned, these are unprecedented times, and we really still have an opportunity. We have so much work to do. We still have an opportunity. And I think this is why this conversation today is critical. Education is indeed just such a great equalizer. So I'm very thankful for your leadership, for HOPE, and to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for hosting this conversation. Before we welcome our moderator and panelists, we'd like to play a special video, a message from our friend and HLI class of 2009 alum, Assemblymember Wendy Carillo, and a dear friend. Assemblymember Carillo was unable to join us today live since she's in session right now, but she was eager to speak to all of you mujeres. So she graciously recorded a message for all of us to hear. Please note that when we stream a video on Zoom, there's a bit of a delay and a lag. You don't need to worry about that. You don't need to adjust anything on your end. Just note it's a small inconvenience of the platform. So let's take a look and let's have a great morning.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Wendy Carillo. I proudly represent Assembly District 51, which includes some of the most historic neighborhoods in the city of Los Angeles, including Echo Park, Highland Park, Mount Washington, all of the Northeast and communities around Dodger Stadium, as well as all of unincorporated East LA. Whoop, whoop. So I am a proud HLI alum. Hope played an incredible role in my career and my development as a leader. Now that the majority of the population in the state is Latino, what does that mean? It means that it is our community that is not getting the education necessary and will soon be transitioning into a very real school to prison pipeline. So how do we change that? So I can speak to you on behalf of LAUSD, which is the district that I represent, the Los Angeles Unified School District. It is the largest school district in the entire state. It serves approximately 735,000 students, 73% of which are Latino, 92% are English learners, majority of whom speak Spanish, followed by students that speak Armenian, Korean, Tagalog, Cantonese, and Vietnamese, to name a few. I know that parents are frustrated, maybe some of you, with trying to figure out the distance learning. Teachers are trying to navigate new platforms, and many low-income families who are essential workers lack access to internet and laptops. Maybe some things that we may take for granted, but are still incredibly far out of reach for many families. And we know that the digital divide is real and the achievement gap is only growing larger. Equal is not the same as equitable, and we cannot, in good conscience, continue to ask school districts across the state to provide more resources while not providing the funding necessary. As schools reopen, teachers and administrators and staff and students will be asked to have PPE. There will be additional cleaning. There will be more health guidelines put in place, and we need to make sure that students and teachers and everyone involved continues to be safe because we don't have a cure for the coronavirus or COVID at this time, and that's still a reality. Lastly, I will say the Latino Caucus, myself, several others, are supporting the legislative Black Caucus priorities when it comes to addressing issues of police violence against communities. And I would highly encourage that you look into that, that your organizations potentially come on board and support. My office is happy to provide Hope any materials necessary and make sure that that gets sent out to everyone. But supporting the Black community is important. Supporting the Black Lives Matter movement is important. Many of you are already doing it, but we as a Latino community need to be more vocal about it, more so than what we have been. So there's a bill, several bills that I'm actually a joint principal author on, and it would be important, I think, that we show up, that we support one another, that we continue moving towards justice, and that organizations like Hope and others come on board to ensure that we are protecting everyone in our community, especially because of the continued videos that we keep seeing that we have normalized and that are not okay. And so I hope that you can join and support and let us know if there's anything that you need. So enjoy your conference, enjoy your virtual conference, and know that we are here for you and we are happy to serve in any capacity. Thank you so much for the invitation, and enjoy your day. Thank you.
That is an incredible message from Wendy Carillo, Assemblymember Wendy Carillo, one of our Hope Leadership alum, which is also referred to as HLI. We're grateful that she was able to tape that message and to provide us some insights of the struggles of education right now at the local level You'll be hearing a lot more about that. And you also wanted to ensure that you all know that Hope has been very supportive of the Black Lives Matters movement. I hope that you will all join us in looking at our website and learning some of the steps that we're taking to ensure that this is an equitable place for all of us and a just place for all of us. So now it's my pleasure to bring on our moderator, Max Espinoza, a senior program officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where he focuses on building political and public will for education reforms that close the opportunity and equity gaps in our states and states across the United States. Max is a dear friend of Hope. We've known him for, over close to 20 years, I want to say, Max. And not only are we grateful to have him join us, but I want to share a fun fact. Education has always been at the forefront of Max's career, as he was a student regent when he was in college. So thank you so much, Max, and look forward to a great conversation with an incredible panel.
Thank you, Helen. And thank you to Melinda and to the leadership of Hope and the many alumni that are part of the Hope Network. Hope has a long and successful history of advocating for policies that positively impact Latinas in the area of higher education, K-12 education, economic empowerment, healthcare, and civic engagement. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is a proud supporter and partner of Hope. Like Hope, the Gates Foundation is committed to working to eliminate inequities around the world. Inequity has come into increased focus with the COVID-19 pandemic and its impacts. And the recent events surrounding police brutality and the killing of George Floyd and other Black Americans remind us that the pervasive racism that continues to exist and the structural inequities that exist within our systems. Today's panel focuses on education, which we know is so important. The COVID pandemic has highlighted the importance of education. Everyone around the world is seeing the disruption of the pandemic and education, and then the inequities that are also being highlighted through the disruption. And then the recent events as well remind us that the need to continue to focus on education and the importance of education for communities. As we get started today, I want to ask the participants to type in the chat box what city and organization you are representing, and just remind participants to submit their questions via the Q&A function. We'll be getting to as many questions as possible at the end of the panel. The format of the panel today, the session, is a little different than yesterday's. We're going to begin with two community advocates, leaders in the community, who will share their perspective and concerns around K-12 education, and specifically around the English learners and the closing of the opportunity gap. Each of these speakers will speak for a little bit, and then we'll have two very distinguished leaders and decision makers who will be giving an opportunity to share their reflections. We're very fortunate to have two of the state's prominent superintendents joining us today, and each will give a few remarks. And then we'll have a few questions that we'll ask the panelists, and then we'll open it up to the questions that you all might have. So with that, let me welcome our panelists. We have Dr. Debra Duardo, who is the superintendent of the Los Angeles County Office of Education. And with Debra Duardo, just a fun fact that I'd like to share about her is that she was a teen mom, and her career actually was in social work. So she actually didn't have a formal education-focused background before becoming superintendent. So comes at this with a very unique perspective. Then we have Superintendent Jorge Aguilar, Superintendent of the Sacramento City Unified School District. Another fun fact about Jorge is he was in my wedding this past October, so he's a dear friend. I'm so glad to have you, Jorge, today. Xilonin Cruz-Gonzalzez, who is the Director of Policy Initiatives for Californians Together. And she also wears another hat as the President of the California School Boards Association. So very, very important, and we're so happy to have you here today. And Gloria Corral, who is the President and CEO of the Parent Institute for Quality Education. So thank you for joining us as well. Fun fact about Xilonin, she was a UC Master Gardener for 10 years. And so that's a unique thing to know about her. And then Gloria went to the Cayman Islands looking for alligators in the Amazon. So another fun fact. Anyway, without further ado, so glad to have everybody here, and appreciate the time that you guys are taking, that you all are taking to be with us today on this for this important event. We're going to have Xilonin actually kick us off, if you don't mind, Xilonin, with your comments, and then we'll go to Gloria.
Great, I'll get started. So good morning, and before I start talking about the education piece, I do want to acknowledge this movement that's happening around the murder of George Floyd, the unjust murder, and focusing on institutional racism. And the reason I bring it up is because we as educators and in the education system know that there's a critical piece in addressing structural racism in schools to help undo what we see throughout our society. And so I just want to acknowledge that, and I'm really happy to be with some equity warriors on this panel to talk about issues about reopening schools. So with saying that, I do want to say I'm going to start by just giving a very overall context in terms of education and reopening. And I'll just start by saying that as a society, I feel like we always talk about how important schools are, but often it really feels like we're just paying lip service to it. But I think this pandemic has really made it clear that education really is a cornerstone of our society. And if we think about moving to reopening our economy, it's really hard to think how you do that without getting kids back in classrooms. So that being said, reopening schools is a very complicated process because all of us want to ensure that our students, our staff, and our communities are as safe as possible. And there's multiple levels to reopening schools, but I want you to understand that ultimately your local school district and your local school board will decide how that reopening happens and what it looks like in your school district. Layered on top of that will be the health guidelines that have been released by the state, by the governor. He released them last week. And most likely your county health officer will also release guidelines that will complement what the governor released last week. But I do want to be clear that these guidelines they release that school districts do have to follow are only really connected to health and safety, not about education and learning in classrooms. And so people like Dr. Debra Duardo from LA County has released guidelines around what we should be thinking about in terms of education and learning. But again, this is just guidance they're not requirements that we have to follow. And so as I say that, I want to shift a little bit to talk about my work. I work for an organization called Californians Together. We're a statewide coalition of professional civil rights community organizations that focus on how to best improve education outcomes for English learners. And we as an organization surveyed educators, both classroom teachers and administrators across the state over the last few weeks around distance learning. About 650 educators responded. And we haven't released the full findings, but I did want to share just three key pieces that we saw. One, most kids are getting very little live instructions. So we saw that most kids are getting maybe less than 2 hours, and many kids are getting half an hour or less of live instruction with a teacher on a weekly basis. Think about this. Kids used to go to school 6 hours a day, and now they're getting half an hour with a teacher once a week. When you look at English learners, they are supposed to get something called English language development, and that's specialized instruction to help kids learn English. And so they're supposed to actually get that every day in a normal setting. We're finding that only half the kids are getting any of it at all. So half your kids aren't even getting that critical piece to help that's helping them learn English and become fluent in English. And then finally, the last thing that we're seeing is with parents, it's very clear that districts are translating most of their materials they're sending home, but when it comes to supporting parents and being that helper to help the students learn in the house, and we're very much asking parents, as many of you know, to be that assistant in the home to help with teaching, they're not getting that help in their language, and they're not getting it in a way they understand so that they really truly can help their students. So that being said, we have a couple recommendations, and this gets back to Latina Action Day, because as I talked about the learning guidelines and how they're just guidelines and not requirements, there are people that do have the ability to require certain things of us, and those people would be the governor and our state legislature. And so saying that, there's several key items that we as an organization are advocating for. One, we really feel it's very, very strongly that the state needs to develop some guidelines around effective distance learning. I think we were operating in a emergency mode the last couple of months, but it looks like moving into the fall, there may be some hybrid or distance learning continuing. And so it's very important that we're clear about what that should look like. For example, the Silicon Schools Fund released a report saying that they've seen in best practice that students should get at least 120 minutes of daily live instruction through distance learning. 2, data reporting. It's very important that we start tracking attendance and how often students are checking in. Many other states are already doing this. We have no way to know who is checking in and coming to school and who's not via distance learning. So that is something the state would have to take action on to have districts report that. Professional learning. It's very important that teachers are given the time and support to learn how to be effective distance instructors. And finally, 2 last pieces, family engagement. We must continue to find ways to support the parents, because they are now our partner in teaching in homes, especially in the language, in their language. And then finally, as we look to reopen, we really need to have an equity framework. And so as we look to bring kids back, often people think about young kids and special ed students. English learners should be part of that group that we bring back first. And we see that happening in states like Virginia. So thank you very much, and I look forward to a really great conversation with everybody.
Great, thank you, Xilonin. Appreciate your remarks. Now we'll turn to Gloria Corral, President and CEO of the Parent Institute for Quality Education. And Gloria, I know that you guys have done a survey of parents, and so very, very grateful that you're joining us today to share your perspective.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Max and Xilonin and Dr. Duardo and Mr. Aguilar. I think this is a really important part of the work that we do as leaders, as parent advocates, and as education advocates, but most importantly, at least from our perspective, as social justice advocates. I think that we cannot do our work really in service of the families and the goal of educational equity without understanding that our jobs, part of our job is really to think about how are we really furthering social justice in a more equitable world, for not just for the children, but equally important for the families and the communities in which we do our work. And so, like Xilonin, I just want to take a moment to say that our commitment as an organization stems from our work and our roots in civil rights. We, as a parent, the Parent Institute for Quality Education, we grew out of the civil rights movement, and our commitment to social justice has and continues to be part of our DNA. And so at this moment, I think our ability to lift up voices of our families and join in lifting up the voices and the needs and the perspective of our Black brothers and sisters is just as important as we continue to move this conversation further, specifically around social justice and educational equity in relationship not just to education, but I think more broadly around institutional racism. And so I'm honored to be on this panel. I think one of the big findings from the survey, that the parent phone surveys that we did, there's 3 big takeaways, right? One is that the families that we serve, which are predominantly low income, predominantly non-native English speakers, immigrant across the state, is that families are experiencing this moment of unrest, both as an economic, health, education, and social justice crisis. And so thinking about the needs of families holistically is paramount. So thinking about both the economic needs, housing, food insecurity. One of the findings that we have is that almost a third of the families that we survey don't have health insurance. Think about that. We're asking families in this context of a health crisis to take care of themselves and their families when oftentimes they are essential workers but are not insured. And so that really takes on a different level of stress in the context of providing for the well-being of their families and being supportive for the well-being of their children. The other is really to lift up the social, emotional, and trauma that communities are experiencing. And in order to do that well, it's really understanding that families come and are living through this moment with particular challenges, both in terms of Xilonin mentioned, language access, connectivity. And so one of the things that our survey found, for instance, was that 1 in 3 parents, about a third, don't have an email address. Now, for many of us, that might seem very, might seem foreign, but think about it. We are asking families to navigate in a virtual construct without an email address, which is basically your identity, right? Your online identity. You can't log on to a school portal or to apply for benefits and a whole bunch of things if you can't actually navigate through an online virtual world. And then finally, I want to just highlight that, as Xilonin was saying, the needs of our EL families are particularly highlighted, mostly because as parents take on this additional role of being a co-facilitator to learning, less than 45% of the families, or about a little bit less than half, actually are having any context or any supports for their EL students. And so again, as we think about the education and learning gaps and inequities, this really is the context around which we have to do our work. And so as I close, there are 2 big important asks that we encourage all our partners to think about. One is that we think about education more holistically and educational supports more holistically around family engagement, which includes both capacity building of teachers and educators, skills building and supports for families, digital literacy training for families in a language and in a manner that's accessible. And then finally, really thinking about health and mental health as part and parcel of creating the kind of environment for families to support the well-being of their children. And so thinking through, how do we open up additional opportunities for health coverage for families? And also, how do we ensure that we're able to provide mental health supports to process the trauma that families are experiencing more holistically, so that they can partner with teachers and school communities in a constructive way. So I'm excited to be part of this conversation and continue to support our colleagues and our partners in education and beyond to really support the well-being of children and close and encounter this crisis head on. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gloria. Thanks for sharing that unique and important perspective. Now we have the opportunity to hear from 2 of the state's important and prominent superintendents who are on the front lines of responding and addressing the crisis that we're in. And first we have Dr. Debra Duardo, who leads the Los Angeles County Office of Education, one of the largest, I think it may even be the largest county in the entire state. So Dr. Dorado.
Buenos dias, and thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here with the other panelists. I just also want to acknowledge these are very difficult times. In my career of 30 years, I've never seen anything quite like it. In addition to a worldwide health pandemic, we've seen the murder of Mr. Floyd and all of the civil unrest that are taking place right now. And although it's very difficult to see and hear and participate in some of these conversations, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that it will bring about real change, not just conversation, but action. So that was a lot of information that was shared by Xilonin and Gloria. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of perspective from my end. In LA County, we have 80 school districts representing about 2 million children. And as the superintendent for the county, I work with 80 different superintendents who have local control about the type of instructional programs and how they choose to reopen their schools. All of them, of course, have the safety and well-being of their children and their staff in the forefront. So just a few responses. I want to say one, in terms of effective distance learning, there's no question that we need students to engage live with their teachers. They need to see their teachers. They need to talk to their teachers, especially English language learners. It's so important that they're having that opportunity to have that live instruction back and forth, and they need more of that. Some of these things are complicated because they do require union negotiations if there isn't something set, as Xilonin said, from the governor that directs everyone for a certain amount of time. So I just want to say that I absolutely agree that that's important. I think we need to continue to look at data. We need to understand that this pandemic and these school shutdowns have impacted students and families in very different ways. For some families that are educated, that are financially more safe and positioned well, it hasn't been as challenging. For students whose economic situation is more difficult, who may be living in a one-bedroom apartment with 8 other people, that may not have access to the internet or to devices. And even as districts struggle to get them those devices and Wi-Fi access, a lot of those things were on back order and not easily accessible. So again, I just want to say that all of these things that we're seeing are discrepancies, inequalities that existed far beyond COVID-19. These are issues that I believe stem from systemic institutional racism in every sector of our communities, including education. And so we have a lot of work to do to make sure that we're holding everybody accountable and that we will not tolerate these types of inequities. You know, I just want to say that districts should be held accountable, that compulsory education has not gone away, that children ages 6 to 18 are still required to attend school, whether that's in person or through distance learning, and that educators, parents, and students all need to be held accountable to that. I also want to talk about family engagement, and I think it's really important that we think about what we're asking parents to do. We have overnight asked parents to become much more involved in their child's education. As was already mentioned, these may be parents, especially for low income, English, you know, las familias que no hablan inglés, you know, very difficult for them to suddenly be able to communicate online. We have to have a lot of training for our parents, but I think it starts with that engagement and support and reaching out to our families and checking in with them, not only about their educational program, but how are they doing? Are they experiencing food insecurity? Do they have access to the tools that they need? Many of our parents are essential employees and continue to work and put their lives at risk and have their children sometimes being supervised by older siblings who are challenged to do their work as well as helping their younger siblings or taking care of very young children who aren't even enrolled in school. So we need to connect with our students, with our families. We need to show them that we care about them, and we need to let them know that we are here to support them in whatever way they deem necessary. And that means listening to students, listening to parents, not assuming that we have all of the answers, but understanding that they do. And so last, I just want to say that, you know, when I talk about these inequities, again, this is not something that happened with COVID-19. We are talking about decades of an opportunity gap that cannot be normalized, that needs to be changed. And it's going to take all of us standing up, taking a position, and being very clear that we will not accept it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Duardo. And thank you for everything you're doing. You have been such a courageous voice among the state leadership on these issues, and thank you for taking on these issues head on in the way that you have. We'll have an opportunity to ask Dr. Duardo more questions in a little bit here. In the meantime, I want to turn to Superintendent Jorge Aguilar, and Superintendent Aguilar is the leader of one of the largest school districts in the state, district in Sacramento, Northern California. And with that, Jorge.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Buenos dias. First, I want to just thank Hope for the invitation to participate. I'm really honored to be part of this panel and join the panelists here, many of whom I've had the opportunity to work with in the past. I also just want to acknowledge I have many comadres in Hope. One of my comadres actually baptized our twin boys and has been involved with Hope for many years. So thank you for the work that you do. I just want to acknowledge what everyone else has already done, and that is the effects of how our education system has been designed and the lasting impact on our most vulnerable students, particularly our Black and our Brown, our Southeast Asian students. I'm a big follower of improvement science and continuous improvement, and always remind my staff that every system is designed to get the results that it gets, and also that culture will always eat strategy for lunch. And so it's on us to make a determination whether this is the time in which we commit to actualize, truly actualize an equity, access, and social justice agenda, and what that will look like in terms of actualizing such agenda. And I'll just share with you, as we see the effects of institutional racism on our most vulnerable youth, Sac City Unified, and I've challenged myself and I've challenged all of our staff, has some of the highest suspension rates of African-American students throughout the state. So this is a time in which we have to look very closely at how we have allowed a system that was designed with a lot of racist policies to be perpetuated or to be changed. I do want to acknowledge, I've been trying to follow the chat window, so many individuals from Los Angeles, where I started my teaching career in LA Unified, many people from Fresno, where I spent about 20 years working both at UC Merced and at Fresno Unified, and then I see a number of people from Sacramento, which has been our home for the past 3 years. I do want to give you context very quickly in the few minutes that I have. I'm the parent of 3 children who are in my own school district in Sac City Unified. Our eldest daughter just graduated last year from Sac City Unified. Today's our last day of instruction in Sac City Unified, and my mom actually came to visit. So this is a very timely panel in that a lot of my commentary is going to be based on my own upbringing as the son of migrant farm workers. I was born in Delano because my parents had just finished picking table grapes, and I grew up picking table grapes. And I just want to give that context because as I'm also a parent of 3 Sac City Unified students who saw distance learning for my own children over the past 8 months, I want to spend time talking this morning about what Xilonin talked about, which is why is it that we saw such a wide variation in the quality of distance learning programs? Why is it that many of our students probably continue to see the same rigorous instruction day in and day out, and others were not contacted by some of our teachers. And for parents like my own parents, they would not be able to, as the majority of our parents today, they will not be able to compensate for the loss of learning. Many of you may be aware of a phenomenon in education called summer loss. And in communities like Sacramento, it is real. It is simply the idea that many of our students will go out for the summer and will come back with less academic knowledge. Well, you can imagine with this pandemic loss, for some of our families and for our students, and the early research is starting to attest to that, we're talking about 3, 4, 5 months of lost learning because of the pandemic, and then coming up in the next 8 weeks of summer loss. I also want to just leave you as we go into some question and answers with something that I'm struggling with a lot as somebody that follows policy a lot, is how do we deal with the tension between guidance and direction that we're getting from the state and other entities. And I have my own thoughts about this, but I think in some cases in distance learning, guidance is not going to be sufficient for us to meet the needs of our students. And I'm hoping that we can come together and more openly talk about this tension between state entities and others, trying to be respectful of our local context by giving us guidance in a time when I think that we actually need direction and orders.
Thank you, Superintendent Aguilar. And thank you just for your courageous leadership as Superintendent of Sacramento Unified. Superintendent Aguilar, like Dr. Duardo, are on the front lines, and it is not easy being in these roles, and they have chosen this as their profession and have shown through their actions how committed they are to equity and ensuring that all children succeed. So thank you both for your comments and for your leadership. We're very fortunate to have leaders like you in these roles. So with that, we're going to go through some questions, and I just want to remind the audience that we will have an opportunity for some of your questions to be answered, and just remind you to write those in the chat box, and we like to know what city and organizations you're with, if possible, when you submit your questions. So we just have a few questions we'd like to ask the panelists. We'll start with the first one that is really timely with what's happening currently. Racial inequalities and structural racism are now at the forefront of public discourse, given the unjust killing of George Floyd and other Black Americans. From your point of view, what are some ways that racism has manifested itself in the California K-12 schools, and what can be done about it? How might racism be impacting Latinas in particular in the schools, and English language learners as well? So I think we'll start with Xilonin and then Gloria, and then ask the superintendents as well if they have any comments.
Yeah, thank you, Max. And I think that we can all, I just want to say, just to answer your question, I want to acknowledge that we can all see the racism, and you see it through the impacts through the unequal outcomes that we see in terms of access students have when they leave our school system, or even in our school system. What I really want to jump to is thinking about what we can do as a system to undo some of this structural racism. I think there's two pieces to it. One are the actual structural pieces, like decisions we make about who has access to AP classes, who is getting into honors classes, who gets into GATE classes, what kind of instruction are English learners getting? Are they getting access to bilingual education where they can learn to become bilingual and have 2 languages fluency? So there's those pieces, but like Jorge said, I love the way, when you say you can't, that's culture eats strategy for lunch. Well, the other piece of that, and I thought I heard it from Pedro Noguera first, but now I know it's from Malcolm X, that you can't legislate culture, right? You can't legislate that. You can't make policy. So we really need to talk about what can we do to make that internal change happen on an individual basis with the people in our schools that are touching kids. So I think with that, I mean, I could go on forever, but I think that's the piece that I want to hand off to our other panelists.
Great. Gloria.
You know, I think just building on what Xilonin just said, I think also from our perspective, it's really thinking about how we are able to talk about the needs to think through training for our educators to really lift up just cultural bias, racism as part of our professionalizing and learning how best to address it. It has to be lifted up, in my view, both from our institutions. So what are those policies and practices of disproportionately having policing on our campuses, right? Of expulsion rates and what drives that, right? So I think those are very those are policies that are embedded in some assumptions about ways in which we educate children, or those that we choose not to educate. So lifting that up and saying, how do we as educators or policymakers think about these things? I think the other piece, which is a particularly important part of this, is how is it, and I think Dr. Dorado mentioned this, how is it that we as institutions, education institutions, are actually listening to the perspective of families? And I think one thing that if I could leave you with, I think, is that we do have a set of assumptions about, especially in the context of distance learning, not exclusive to it, that that parents can or can't do certain things because they are or are not these things, right? And I think Superintendent mentioned this, right? When you are having families who work, who are living paycheck to paycheck, or are essential workers, what are our assumptions about their ability to engage? And then what drives then our responses to those assumptions? And so I think allowing a lot more dialogue and actually training of our staff, of our partners, of our educators, and our families to engage in these learning opportunities is really fundamentally how we're going to change the way in which we look at policy and decision making that is both legislative, right? But also, as Xilonin said, and Dr. Noguera has said, it's about honoring the assets that we bring and listening really with a goal of understanding and not judging. And so I would say that both our professional development of our staff and skills building of our families, it's when those come together that we really are going to fundamentally address some of these structural policy and institutional racism. But most importantly is how we're going to change how families and communities come together to serve a greater purpose around educational equity.
Thank you, Gloria. Dr. Duardo?
Thank you. Well, I think it's pretty obvious that systemic racism has a role in education, as I said, in every other sector of society. And that's obvious by the disproportionate outcomes, whether it's you're looking at higher suspension rates, students of color and Latinos, EL learners being placed in remedial courses, not having access to A through G courses, less likely to be placed in advanced placement courses, overrepresented in special education. And this is not in one area. I mean, that's the thing that makes it so obvious. It's not like there's just one problem in this one area. We see this across the country. You also need to think about the history of experience in education. We have to remember at one point, students of color from low socioeconomic backgrounds were placed in non-academic tracks. My husband, who ended up becoming, a principal and a strong musician, his college counselor told him he should be a barber and forget about his dreams of music or, education, that's what he should do. And there are many students that were taught that. In my own family, I'm one of 5, and all of us dropped out of high school. My brothers like to say they were kicked out or asked to leave. I left because I thought that's what everybody did. So, became a mom when I was 16, and nobody came looking for me or talking to me about, the choices that I made. We also have to see that You know, a lot of times our schools, you know, even though we don't have segregation anymore, it feels like we're segregated because you see that we have a tendency to have schools that are predominantly Latino, predominantly African American, the schools that are the least funded, that have the least amount of resources. And I think that this really has an impact on our outcomes. So yeah, is there racism? Absolutely. What do we need to do about it? We need to start having strong conversations. I agree that you cannot legislate culture, but I think it's a good start. You know, we have to have policy in place that will not tolerate it, and we need to make sure that we are enforcing that policy. Because what I find in many areas is, yeah, these policies exist, but that doesn't mean that people are following those policies and that they're protecting the children that they were intended to protect. So I think we have to, again, have more training. I think we need to see more people of color enter the teaching profession. I think that that would make a big difference in terms of people being more empathetic and understanding of the children and the families that they're serving. And, you know, we have to continue to advocate to not tolerate these discrepancies and to partner with anybody who's willing to partner with us, because schools and districts cannot do this work alone. We need to have people from nonprofits, we need the faith-based organizations, we need our county departments, we need everybody aligned saying we will not tolerate this and we are going to implement and create change for our most vulnerable, marginalized students. Thank you.
Thank you, Superintendent Aguilar.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Max. I'm going to try to focus on the last portion of the question, which was focused on English learner students. You know, we are a very diverse community in Sacramento, and we have many students who are newcomer English learners in our community. I am very, very anxious and upset about, again, I'm gonna come back to this space that I don't think is getting enough attention, because there's real tension between guidance and direction and even orders. I see no reason why in this space of distance learning, we cannot have a common definition across the state for what engagement looks like, both at the teacher level. What does teacher engagement look like and how are we gonna monitor that? What does principal engagement look like and how are we gonna monitor that? Because the reality is, you know, I try to remind our parents as often as I can that the educational rights that their children had before the pandemic are the same educational rights that they have during the pandemic. But I am deeply, deeply concerned that the wide variation in the quality of distance learning in part is because we are only getting guidance about what distance learning should look like. We should have a common definition, particularly for our most vulnerable populations, our English learner students, our newcomer students, whether they should be receiving 4 hours of instruction, 3 hours of instruction, 2 hours of instruction, whether the best instructional platform for that population of students is Google Classroom. I mean, we're on Zoom today, but Zoom is a communication platform. It's not an instructional platform. So I want to be able to verify that our students received this, that our students submitted assignments, that we are providing common assessments to determine whether our students are growing academically. Again, this is a space with a lot of tension that is not getting the attention that I think our students and our families deserve, particularly our most vulnerable families. And I'll just say that I would absolutely count our families of English learners in that group. There is not enough demand, no call to action as far as I've been able to tell, for there to be the development of common definitions for what engagement should be.
Great, thank you for sharing that perspective, Superintendent Aguilar. The next question I'd like to ask, and I'm going to actually ask that our two superintendents answer this question just in the interest of time. The as school districts face potential budget cuts and fiscal constraints from the state's pandemic-induced recession and fiscal crisis, what can state policymakers and local school districts and leaders like yourself do to mitigate the impact on English learners in particular? And I know that both of you have been speaking out about these issues, and Dr. Duardo, I know that you've also given some guidance about the crisis to school districts. So if both of you could share a little bit about how you're thinking about this and what you're concerned about as well.
Who do you want to start?
Oh, go ahead, Dr. Duardo. Thank you. Yeah, we'll start with you.
Thank you. So, I mean, if I had to pick one thing as we're looking at these potential budget cuts that I'm really concerned about, is that many districts are asking for flexibility around their spending. And many of you know that districts are funded through a local control funding formula that is based on equity, looking at which students need the most support and ensuring that we have resources for those students. So in California, it's students who are English language learners, low-income students, and foster youth. And what I'm concerned and have been hearing is districts asking for flexibility on not having to spend their LCFF dollars on the students that it was intended to serve. So they're supplemental students. I think it's really important that we stand up against that. I have been very clear that although we are in a financial, crunch or crisis, that this deficit should not come off of the backs of students who need the support the most, who've had the most difficult time with distance learning, and that we need to make sure that we're not allowing districts to say, because of this financial situation that we're in, we're not going to be held accountable to making sure that we're spending those dollars on our most vulnerable students who are going to need support. So if I were to pick one thing, I would definitely say that we need to advocate for no cuts to education at a time where we're going to need more money than ever, but even more importantly, not to allow any flexibility around the local control funding formula, and not to allow money that was intended for our most vulnerable students be used in different ways.
Thank you, Dr. Dorado.
Yeah.
Superintendent Aguilar?
I completely agree, and I'll be short on this one. I think there absolutely has to be some fence posts. Sac City is a district that was already in fiscal distress prior to the pandemic. We faced a $27 million deficit before it. And we're all looking to see what happens with the state budget over the next few days. But I completely agree with Superintendent Duardo. There's got to be some fence posts put. And again, particularly for our most vulnerable students and families, money has to get to compensate for the loss of instruction. I've said to our community, I've got twin boys. When you're a seventh grade, in seventh grade, most of our seventh graders read The Outsiders. My wife and I, of course, had read it many, many years ago, and she bought the book and read it herself, and was working with our twin boys around that, because that's what we do. We were compensating for the loss of instruction and the loss of support for our own children, but the vast majority of our families can't do it, and so there has to be fence posts put around any funding that comes from the state to meet the needs of our most vulnerable students.
Great, thank you, Jorge, for your reflections on that. I'm going to ask that the next question we have be responded to by our two advocates, or two community leaders here, and then we're going to shift to Q&A from the audience. So I know the audience is eager to have some of their questions answered. So for our two advocates that are on the panel, what role can community members, advocates and parents play from your perspective in advocating for English learners and and for their children. Similarly, what can the audience do? The audience, we have a number of folks on listening in and watching. What could they do? And we'll have the superintendents at the end also address that question, or if you all can weave it into your responses later. What can the community do to advocate supporting English language learners and helping to close opportunity gaps? What are actions that some people, that folks can take? Xilonin and then Gloria?
Oh, I was gonna let Gloria go first because I keep on going first. Do you mind?
Sure, we could switch. Gloria.
I think very concretely, and I really want to applaud the courageous leadership of our education leaders here, because I do think it's about, in terms of a community response, is supporting those voices of that, both of our superintendents are raising here, because it's not going to be easy. One of the things that they often say, right, is that budgets are policy documents, right? You fund what you believe in. And I think more than ever that it has to be true, that if we are going to succeed at addressing at this moment some of these structural issues, we need everyone that's on this webinar and all of those that we touch to really say equity has to be the guiding principle around our budget decisions, right? So we have to be able to say, are we, if we have $100, is 80% of them being spent around equity, related activities? Are we funding supports for families? Literally, is the district, our policymakers emphasizing that as a key structural policy decision around budgeting, right? And I think those are the questions that all of our talented colleagues here can raise. If a budget document is a policy document, then is the budget really reflecting those values, right? Are we investing and ensuring that families, especially our English language families, are having access, not just the technical part? I think the digital divide is the easier issue to address, connectivity and equipment. But are we spending, is the budget reflecting training for families so that families can effectively engage, as the superintendents here have said? So that to me is a critically important part. Asking each one of us here, asking that question, going to these virtual, school board meetings, reaching out to the principals in your district, to the superintendent in your area, and saying, I want to know how you are responding to the needs of our English language learners, of our most vulnerable low-income communities, of our immigrant communities. And so, but I think it's really thinking through, is our budget reflecting our values, and are those values equitable, equity-minded, and what role do families play in this context? Is there funding for mental health supports? Are there fundings to do digital literacy supports for families that is in a language and in a format that works for them? These are very concrete steps that each of us can take as we engage with our school partners in supporting their priorities in this context of a lot of need. And so it has to be grounded on our equity principles.
Great,
so I know I mentioned a couple in my opening remarks, and so I just want to reinforce two pieces, right? One, I think Gloria is exactly right. All of you need to be focused on your local school districts. As Dr. Duardo talked about, we are living under local control, so your local school district and your local school board is going to make most of the decisions around what this looks like moving forward and how those dollars are spent. But there are some advocacy pieces that you need to look at the state level. And I think we heard Jorge really clearly lay some of these out, right? And I've talked about them. One, there have to be some minimal standards around distance learning in terms of how many hours do we expect teachers to be live with students, either on a daily basis or a weekly basis. That needs to be done at a state level and could be done either through legislation, through the budget trailer bill, or through a governor's executive action. Two, we need to have some kind of reporting accountability. We've given everyone, and ourselves included, a pass in terms of who's checking in, how many students are coming to school, either on a daily or weekly basis. There are many other states that even in the last couple of months have required districts to report either on a daily or weekly basis how often their kids check in. moving forward, we need to have some kind of mechanism to make that happen. Again, that has to be some kind of state level action, whether it's a governor's executive order or legislation. In terms of the funding piece, like Dr. Dorado talked about, right? I think that right now there's a gap between what the governor's proposing. He wants to make sure that the federal funding is going to go to districts that have large percentages of English learners, low-income students, and foster youth. Right now, the legislature's budget is not doing that. They're spreading the money over all the districts across the state. There has to be some kind of fairness around that, but the governor has been very clear about he wants to have an equity-based approach. And so we need to make sure as advocates that we are saying as well that we want to see an equity-based approach to education funding when it comes to the dollars that are put in to backfill our state dollars that are coming from the federal government. And then finally, the last, I think, critical piece is in terms about who gets to come back to school. I mentioned earlier, so Virginia from the state level has said, okay, the priority is going to be young children, special ed students, and English learners. I would like to see our state do the same thing and say, this is the priority, and this is how we need to prioritize how we bring students back. I appreciate that we've prioritized, up to now, we've been prioritizing the students of essential workers. Right, I think that's very important. But we also need to think about those farm workers, those grocery workers that are essential workers that have had to continue to work, that don't have the resources to be able to hire somebody to take care of their kids while they're working, and make sure that they're also part of that group. And so I think those are those pieces. I think there are many more pieces that I believe could be done, but I think those are really the critical pieces that our state leaders need to hear from us and from all of you, that if we really want to address inequities in our system moving forward, these are the pieces that we want you to take action on so that statewide we have some kind of uniformity.
That's great. I'd like to ask, I know I was going to go to Q&A, but I just want to ask the two superintendents really quickly if they don't mind giving us just like one thing the audience could do to be responsive, and then I'll jump to Q&A. Dr. Duardo?
Well, I totally agree with everything Xilonin has said. Advocating at the state level, that type of accountability that requires all districts to have this accountability that needs to take place. And I'd also add to that, just advocating that we cannot afford to take budget cuts in education at a time where our students have lost so much instruction and we're in the middle of a health pandemic. So those are the two things that I would add.
Great. Superintendent Aguilar?
Yeah, just very quickly, Max, I would say just a call for transparency during this time, both for how districts are using their resources, but also how are we responding to both the academic and social and emotional needs of our students. The state suspended the state accountability test, which I think is fair, but I am inspired by many of the reopening frameworks that call for an explicit use of common formative assessments to understand what were the actual losses of instruction and the impact of that lost instruction of our students. I think we have to be held to account for better understanding what the impact of this pandemic is on the academic, social, and emotional well-being of our students, and then being held accountable for making improvements. This is a different learning environment, and I'm very open as superintendent to be held accountable for a different set of metrics than the ones that are in place right now by the State Department, by the Department of Education.
Great, thank you. So we have an audience question that is actually specific to college readiness and Latinas. As many of you know, Latinas have been leading the way in college attendance and attainment, and we're very fortunate that that's the case. And so there's a concern from one of the audience members, and I'm sure it's shared by many, that the COVID-19 situation will impact the ability for college readiness. And so the question is, are there any policies that folks should be proposing or advocating that would help address what could be a very problematic widening of the opportunity gap? And I'm gonna ask folks to just be really brief. I'll ask our superintendents to respond to that first. Superintendent Aguilar, and then we'll go to Superintendent Dorado.
Yeah, excellent question. I'm really just inspired and motivated. Thank you. I've been trying to track the chats, and I want to recognize Alejandra Lopez from Colinga, who mentioned her story about having been admitted to Cal, go Bears, and her counselor saying that she should go to a community college instead. Only because I am concerned about the impact of this pandemic on what we in research refer to as undermatching. This idea that students have qualified and have an academic profile that puts them in a place where they can attend a selective college or university and might choose not to attend that type of college or university, not because I have a bias necessarily, but I am concerned about the rate at which students are going to undermatch themselves because of this pandemic. So to your question, Max, from a policy standpoint, I would absolutely like to see some more engagement from the federal government related to loan forgiveness, or at least subsidizing in some other way interest on loans, so that students are still incentivized. Of course, I mean, keeping in mind the health and safety of our children during the pandemic, but to the extent that we can impact that, I'm struggling about how this pandemic is going to impact the matching rates of students to attend selective colleges and universities if they have that academic profile. And one of the reasons is because, I can tell you as my daughter, who's a freshman in college as well, I mean, I wonder, is it worth paying tuition and fees for distance learning while she's home with us? It would make a difference if there were other policies in place where people aren't thinking about the additional expenses to pursue an education at a selective college or university. Again, if that's what the academic profile of our students calls for.
Great, thank you, Jorge. Dr. Duardo?
I agree with Superintendent Aguilar. I just want to say how important it is that we're reaching out and connecting and providing supports to students who are in the middle of making this decision, these very difficult decisions that oftentimes they don't have the tools or they don't have people in their family that can guide them through these decisions. So we had a student panel a couple days ago, and one of the student panelists was a Latino young man who was accepted to UCLA and was saying that he was thinking of taking a gap year because he has to help support his family financially. He needs to work. And so when asked, well, how are you making this decision? Who's helping you to make this decision? He didn't have anybody. He didn't feel like his parents, he said his parents would say, well, do whatever you think is the right thing to do. But we need to make sure that we have counselors, that we have teachers, that we have people that are reaching out to seniors and saying, we understand your challenges, we understand the need for financial support, and let's talk about how we can address those issues and to help them process and come to the decision that's right for them, but with having the information and the tools that they need in order to make that decision.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Dr. Duardo. I'm going to ask this question of the two advocate leaders on the call, on the video. What would you say from your perspective, this is from an audience member, needs to be the long-term plan for when students and schools return to a learn from home environment this coming fall? In case they're all at home or some are at home, what do you think folks should be worried about and thinking about at this time? And what advice would you give the two superintendents who are here with us today? And we'll do Gloria and then,
so I think,
Oh, go ahead, Xilonin.
Okay, so I think a couple things, right? I think there are some, and you see this in some school districts and some places. This is really an opportunity. Within crisis is great opportunity, right? So this is really an opportunity for us to think about how do we reimagine public education. We talk about 21st century schools, but you haven't seen much change, right, within the century. So how do we, seeing some of the things that we're learning in distance learning in terms of how some kids can learn some things in different modalities, how do we adopt some of that and integrate some of that and do it to the benefit of our students? I'll just give you one example. I think, often our instruction is tied to a textbook, and that's what guides us. You've seen a lot of movement towards project-based learning or civics engagement, where kids are, because they need that space to sort of explore and understand, right? They're giving them projects where they can do that work. So how can we take that learning and say, okay, if we're going to go back into a classroom, we should continue giving kids the opportunity to learn and stretch as learners, as individuals in that school setting, and not just because it was a crisis situation. I mean, those are the kind of, I think, learning opportunities that are openings for us to think about. And those are ways to undo a lot of the systemic racism that we have in our schools.
Thank you. Gloria.
I'm going to focus, because I totally agree with Xilonin. I'm going to focus on some of the opportunities that I see that I know our superintendents are leaders in thinking about, but I'll give you, in my mind, there's one specific aspect of the work as we transition back in whatever format. It's really providing clarity, and I think Xilonin talked about this, right? But providing clarity about what is the expectation of the teacher and the principal, the counselors, the school community with respect to connecting with families. I think that, kind of in the traditional model, the expectation was open house, right? That there was an open house night, and then there was a teacher conference, and maybe a graduation or end of year party, right? Those were kind of the touchstones for families in this context. And as we move forward, I think reimagining what this teacher-family connection looks like, and then being very clear about what that is, and really reimagining that dialogue with families so that teachers can really better understand the home context, so that they can then respond to that home context, like individualized instruction, right? Now you really need the parent or the caregiver to tell you as a teacher what opportunities or what context the children are in, so that you can then adapt, not water down, but adapt your instructional strategies, as Xilonin was saying, to use the context in the communities that they live. And so for me, it's who's checking in with those families, what's the frequency with which that happens, and then what's the intent, or to have clarity about that intent, right? It's so that collectively, as a caretaker, whether that's the parent or another adult in the house, and the teacher can then really partner around how best to structure a learning environment for the child and the children, and because often there's multiple children in the home. And just one quick example, there's this notion that you need to find a quiet place to do homework. Well, if there's 8 people in the home in a 2-bedroom apartment, a quiet place may not be feasible. However, if you come together as a teacher and a parent and decide, from 5:30 to 6:30, we as a family have quiet time, right? That notion of coming together to be focused around learning can really shift. And so that's just an example that can only be created when there's an understanding of the home environment as a learning environment. And that's what I would say we can and should be thinking about.
Great.
Max, I have just 2 quick things, really, if you might not mind.
It has to be fast, sorry.
Yeah. I know, really fast. So I think there's 2 specific things we should look at. One, Jorge talked about learning loss. Well, we have summer loss, and we've always known that, right? We should be thinking about, why do we go to year round like all the other countries in the world, right? 2, when we went to distance learning, the first reaction was, oh, we can't give kids any assignments because they can't learn at home. They have no help. Well, we give it every day. It's called homework. right? So those are two things that we should think about, like, do they really fit and should they be part of ongoing?
Great, thank you, Xilonin, and thank you, Gloria. And I see that our two superintendents nodding and listening, and so I just want to acknowledge that we don't have time to have them respond, but appreciate that they're absorbing what was just said, and I'm guessing agree with a lot of what was said. Well, with that, I just want to really thank the panelists. I think it's very obvious that all of you are committed and extremely passionate about educational equity and opportunities for all students. And I just want to acknowledge you for spending this time with us and for, in some cases, rearranging your calendars to be here. This is such an important conversation, and HOPE is such an important organization with such a powerful network across the state and some folks even around the world now and around the nation. And so I want to thank you on behalf of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for you participating in this today, and also for your continued work. We all know that this is just the beginning of a very long and challenging road ahead, and we appreciate your leadership, all of you. And I also want to just acknowledge that I know that HOPE as an organization will continue to engage in these issues and put efforts and resources and forums and things throughout the next several years to really dig deeper into these issues and take it on and activate the network, the powerful HOPE network that exists throughout the state. And thank you, Helen and HOPE for allowing me the honor to moderate this panel, this very distinguished panel. And we are so proud to partner with HOPE, and thank you all.
Yes, thank you so much, Max, for your leadership, for your support of HOPE. It has been an incredible discussion. I have cramps in my hands from writing so much, and there's so many action steps that I'm looking forward to highlighting, but I do want to give a heartfelt thank you to our panelists. The panelists included, as we all know, Superintendent Debra Duardo, Superintendent Jorge Aguilar, our HLI alum, Xilonin Cruz-Gonzalzez, and Gloria Corral. Thank you all for making time this morning. I think if you were tracking the chat and the questions and Q&A and all the text that I was getting, a lot of great information, a lot of good activity, and incredible participation from our, not only from conversation across our panelists, but from the participants of this webinar. And as we switch from a panelist format, I am excited to say that we were able to get a video from Senator Maria Elena Durazo, who sits on the Senate Education Committee. She wants to share a little bit of what she's working on right now. We're going to go to that video, and then we're going to wrap it up with some key action steps. So please tune in. But once again, a big thank you to our panelists, and a big thank you to you, Max, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Thank you for inviting me to speak at your 26th annual Latina Action Days. Thank you, Hope, for all the work that you do every single day. I'm really sorry I couldn't join you in person via Zoom as originally planned. I'm on the Senate floor deliberating this year's legislative bills. I want to congratulate you all for participating in this conference. As you know, this year is historic. First, the global health pandemic and the public health care crisis, and of course, the dramatic disparities in our communities. Now we're facing the ongoing crisis caused by the decisions to control the spread of COVID-19. Again, we find major inequalities with the job losses, whether we are in essential industries or left with no safety net, or a small business unable to pay the rent. We are also finally having a conversation about racism across our nation as a result of the killing of George Floyd. This has provoked millions around the world and in hundreds of cities in the US, large and small. Earlier this week on the Capitol steps, the majority of the state legislature, including our leadership, took a knee for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. We challenged ourselves to address the racism in police brutality but frankly, in the entire incarceration system, including ICE. If we ask ourselves whether Latinos have a policing issue, the short answer is yes. Latinos dying in the hands of police, sheriffs, and ICE agents, children being locked up in cages, and sexual abuse in detention centers. Sisters, and I think some brothers, these days in Sacramento, we are cramming a legislative session that normally lasts months into a few weeks because of COVID-19. And we have to make budget decisions that will impact millions of men, women, and children. Our circumstances have changed, but our values should not. Mine have not changed. I continue to push for health care for all seniors, regardless of immigration status, because they are the most affected in California and because they deserve access to primary care. Latinos in California account for 51% of the positivity rates for COVID-19 and 40% of total deaths. That is unacceptable. I want to thank Hope for sharing the findings of the Parent Institute for Quality Education survey. The digital divide is nothing new for communities of color, but it is now center stage in the distance learning model that we've adopted due to COVID-19. Some of your findings in the report indicate that 1 in 3 parents do not have email addresses. 21% of students did not receive the equipment necessary to participate in online classes. The pandemic has also forced parents to take on the educator role at home. That is not easy to do. A subset of the regional responses to your survey indicate 45% of English language families are not receiving support. 70% of families do not know if their student is meeting the IEP requirements while on distance learning. Some people ask, when are we going back to normal? I don't want to go back to normal, except to be able to see my granddaughters, Sydney and Seneca. I want a new normal that is fair and just and equal and creates opportunities for everybody in the same way. I want to thank you for fighting for a Latina working class communities. I promise to be at your side. Que viva la mujer y adelante todos juntos.
Once again, that was Senator Maria Elena Durazo. She wasn't able to join us live because of the session that they're having, but I hope you all were able to glean a lot from what she's concentrating on. And I want to ensure that we also talk a little bit about the action steps that we heard loud and clear. I'm not going to go through all of them because I want to be conscientious of time, but one of the key ones is communication with the governor's office and the state legislators as they're debating the budget to ensure that there isn't education cuts. Our children have suffered enough under this pandemic. We don't need additional suffering. We also need them to understand that they need to put mandates or guidelines that can be enforced at the local level around distance learning, specifically collecting data and about absenteeism, the amount of time instruction with teachers that is an interaction, and just how our kids are being connected during these times of distance learning. Another key thing around racism is the training of our teachers, our counselors, our administrators to ensure that they have the right curriculum and that are addressing this head on, that this is something that you cannot legislate, but it is something that we can change in our culture. And our teachers and our education system is a really key part of that. There was a lot more regarding key action steps. Remember, education is decided mostly at the local level. So be informed, connect with your superintendent, connect with your school board, make sure you understand the impacts that distance learning is having in our community and advocate for all our children. As we close out Latina Action Day, I want to give a special thank you to the title sponsor of all 3 days, Chevron. A special thank you, of course, to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for sponsoring this panel and supporting our Hope Leadership Institute. Also, I'd like to thank our strategic sponsors, California Resource Corporation, Comcast, NBC Universal Telemundo, Marathon, Southwest Airlines, and Wells Fargo, as well as our year-round sponsors, AT&T, Spectrum, Kaiser Permanente, and Valero. I'm very grateful to our community affiliates from Latino Riverside Network to the Latina Coalition of the Silicon Valley, to so many of you that hopefully you'll see your names on the slides that we'll be advertising at the end of this session. I also want to ensure that you all tune in tomorrow from 9 to 10:30, where our final day of Latina Action Days will be occurring. That's the California, we'll be talking about the California economic and workforce recovery. And lastly, I want to give a big shout out to Celinda Vasquez, our Latina Action Day chair, our board members that were able to participate via the chat and were very attentive, Elizabeth Atley, Nora Dominguez, Erica Careba, Rosie Arroyo, Lupita Sanchez Conejo, Evelyn Martinez, and Laura Arcienega. And if I missed anyone, I'm so sorry. And a big thank you to our HOPE staff team that has just pivoted so amazing in these times of a pandemic and a lot of social unrest. I hope and pray that you're all safe, healthy, and ready to advocate on Black Lives Matters, on the education equality of our students. And I thank you all for participating. Please visit our website, latinas.org. You will also find materials on Hope's stance on the state budget at www.events-latinas.org/LAD materials. So thank you again and look forward to seeing you all tomorrow.